Hey, good evening and welcome to the smoking section. My name is Emily Ouija and I'll be hosting tonight. And with me is a very special guest, Justin Sanchez. Justin, welcome. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And so Justin is actually a Harvard College student and he is recipient of the Lester Kissel Grant in practical ethics. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're at the Safra Center.
Yeah, so this is my senior year at Harvard. Hopefully graduating in May if everything goes well.
Yes.
I'm actually a neurobiology concentrator and major.
Oh, great. Okay.
But took an interest in ethics and political theory pretty early on in my time at Harvard and joined the Safra Center, the Safra Center for Practical Ethics at the Harvard Kennedy School. They have this undergraduate fellowship that they give to several members of each class to pursue work that contributes something to the understanding of practical ethics.
Okay, and what are practical ethics exactly?
So practical ethics, I mean, we have fellows working on things like recognition and human rights. It's kind of an ambiguous term, but it captures a lot of concerns about distributive justice or basically, I mean, ethics is what is right and wrong. My project is a bit unique.
So tell us a little bit about your project. One, we were really interested to learn about Justin's work at the Safra Center because it has a lot to do with tobacco policy.
Yeah, so I got broadly interested in tobacco policy, coming from a background in the sciences. Most of my academic life has been spent in the sciences and mathematics. And tobacco policy is an area in which the science and the ethical reasoning and the policy directly, there's a real conversation there.
They kind of all come together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So, but last year then there was all this discussion about should we raise the legal age you need to be to buy tobacco from 18 to 21. I was personally interested in the topic because being 20 years old at the time, kind of being skipped over, in this
something that actually affected you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't smoke, but it was kind of interesting to be in that situation and think, okay, well, what if somebody in my position has been smoking for a long time, or I guess legally smoking for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden they're told they can't do this. Dug into commentary on the policy and realized that a lot of people invoke neuroscience as a sort of justification for raising and so there was a connection because people will make arguments like neuroscience tells us that we are not fully developed, our brains are not fully developed until about age 25. We know that addiction disproportionately affects people whose brains are not fully developed, therefore we should raise this, which struck me as a really specious sort of argument because we don't think that way about anything else.
Interesting. So you would actually dispute that as being a valid argument?
Oh yeah, I mean, and actually a lot of people who would call themselves anti-tobacco people have come out and said similar things. Because if it's true that neuroscience categorically tells us that we are not fully developed until 25, that would seem to entail that we should really be rethinking, the age at which we allow people to vote, the age at which we allow people to drive cars, get tattoos, etc. And so it's like, okay, well, what is different about tobacco?
I mean, could we really do anything before we were 25? I mean, if you carry it to that extreme. Yeah, it's true. It's
exactly.
True. That's a good point. Well, I want to read a quote from your paper, and these are in your words. At the heart of my project is this ethical quandary: is it right, acceptable, ethical, moral to spread non-scientific fear about the dangers of smoking secondhand smoke and e-cigarettes if this fear causes less people to use tobacco die prematurely of tobacco-related illness? So would you say that that's kind of the summary of your...
Right, and digging into the history of tobacco policy and the interplay between science and policy, it struck me that a lot of the science that was presented as conclusive from the sort of anti-tobacco, I don't really like that term, but groups like the American Cancer Institute or the American Legacy Foundation, they present these findings on, say, secondhand smoke or smoking in movies or the effects of smoking bans. And when you dig into it, it's not great science. But because in the public eye, it's seen as advancing a good cause, which is less people dying of smoking-related illnesses, then the science sort of gets a pass.
Right.
So
that's an interesting point. I mean, does the science really get a pass? Do you think that the public at large actually realizes how faulty a lot of the science is?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, so yeah, there's a double standard that I notice when big tobacco funds research. That's an instant red flag for people.
Of course, yeah.
Right, and I think it should be because if science is supposed to be an objective pursuit of truth, here's a group with a clear motivation for the science to go one way.
Right.
But when it comes from the other side, people don't hold it to quite the same standard.
Right, and I think a point that's often overlooked is that the other side also has very strong motive.
Sure.
In a completely different way. But, there is also money involved. There's people's careers involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes there's even almost just moral obsessions that certain people have in the anti-tobacco movement.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case because I'm all for people living healthier and living longer, but I'm also for people making their own decisions, and so I'm conflicted personally about how to feel about all this. But to even get to the ethical quandary that I listed, we would have to make the assumption that advancing the anti-tobacco cause is a good cause, which I'm not entirely convinced of anymore.
Interesting, yeah. So it seems like as you dig into it more, it just more and more questions arise.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
I just got done presenting this work to the other fellows, and one of the comments was, "Okay, I could see you going in about 6 different directions."
Wow, that's great. To me, that seems like very promising research on that it opens up so many vistas.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, at some point, because I have deadlines, I'll have to narrow it down. That's just kind of my personality. My academic approach is a little bit of everything.
Great. Well, one aspect, I read your status report, which is sort of as I understand it, you wrote this at the end of June, and this is sort of a halfway point.
Yeah. So the status report is, the final project is going to be a thesis magnitude essay, but I have interim deadlines because I'm receiving funding. So this was just a status report, brief explanation of what I've done so far.
Great. Well, so I know in your status report, you seem to me, at least when I was reading it, to point out what you present as kind of 2 alternative reasons that are presented to the public as reasons for smoking bans being enacted. So, one of them is just the fact that secondhand smoke is a danger to other people. That's the argument presented. But to me, I actually see that the reasoning behind the secondhand smoke being in danger, I kind of saw that as more the Trojan horse, and that was the argument that was used in the beginning of bans. Like, for instance, 10, 15 years ago, when a lot of bar smoking bans were enacted, that was the reason. And I feel like now we're actually hearing more about the other reason that you mentioned, which is that it basically stops people from smoking. It's a way to kind of cut down on people smoking because they just can't smoke anymore. It it shames them, it isolates them.
Yeah.
So I actually see it more as kind of cause and effect of more that anti-smoking campaigners. They used one reason in the beginning, but now they're kind of admitting another reason.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree with that. I think the research that in the 1980s that was trying to show that secondhand smoke is causally related to all sorts of illnesses. That had a pretty clear motivation in my mind to justify restrictions on tobacco companies.
Absolutely.
Because, here the 1964 Surgeon General's report has all this evidence saying smoking is bad for your health. I'm compelled by that evidence, but the secondhand smoke seemed to be, in my mind, and maybe I'm extrapolating too much, but as a policymaker, I say, okay, well, here's this thing a lot of people are doing that seems to be bad for their health. But we can't just restrict them or limit their freedom from doing it because it's bad, So we need some sort of million justification, and that it's causing harm to others. We can't just
do this right off the bat. We can't just suddenly say you guys can't smoke anymore.
Right. Yeah. So we need to be able to show that it's actually harming people other than those people who are smoking. I invoked John Stuart Mill. That was his big harm principle. You can't really justify any policy. I don't think Mill is the be all end all of the conversation, but
I think it's very applicable in this situation. And I think also it really helped to galvanize public feeling about smoking. 20 years ago, I feel like there wasn't much public dislike of smoking. There were always people who disliked secondhand smoke, but there really wasn't that feeling there, that fear.
Right.
And I think now that that has become really the norm.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, and I would have to look more into this. But what, sort of the order of operations here? Is it the case that science is published, and then it hits the lay media and people's moral judgments about smoking change, and then policy gets enacted? Or is it the case that people bring to the table these judgments about smoking that influences the way the science plays out, and then, you know, or is it the case that science only affects the policy first, and then the policy comes out, and then people's moral judgments change?
Right. I mean, personally, I've actually had this argument with some Cambridge council members, because I hold that in the case of smoking, I think it was the policies have affected people's public opinion, and, you know, people disagree with me about that, but that's how I really have seen it developing.
I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, you know. It's always an interplay, a back and forth.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So you mentioned in your status report, you mentioned corresponding with Simon Chapman, who's actually probably one of the world's foremost, I would say, tobacco control researchers, policymakers. So how did you find corresponding with him?
So, I mean, my correspondence with Chapman has been just a few emails back and forth and a long Skype conversation. But I did a bunch of background reading because it was a totally new topic to me. I wasn't really sure where to start. And eventually Chapman's name came up, and I looked into some of the stuff that he had written recently. And I was struck by his commitment, in my view, to like really good science. He's come out against, you know, raising the legal age to 21. He's come out against the smoking in movies ban. He's come out against even like public smoking bans.
Outdoor smoking bans. I know he's been actually quite outspoken against that.
And I was like, okay, well, here's somebody who's, you know, really sympathetic to the anti-tobacco side. Yeah, it's interesting. I would personally actually classify him as an anti-smoker. I think he's someone who really dislikes smoking, but it is interesting because I think he does try to be objective from the science point of view. I mean, in talking to him, I don't get the sense that he dislikes smoking per se or smokers, but I have
gotten that sense, but
fair enough. I'll bring our own.
It's true.
But he's very much for liberty in a kind of an American way, which is, I mean, he's from a country where in Australia the cigarettes are not on display, they're behind the counter, it's all plain packaging. You can't even buy smokeless tobacco in Australia. It's completely illegal.
It's very very extreme in Australia. It's interesting. I mean, I'm not talking about Chapman specifically here, but I have noticed that certain tobacco control researchers, lobbyists, I think some of them have kind of realized that in a sense they've created a monster. I think, you know, some of them tend to be a little more moderate and or seem to want to call for more you know, scientific accuracy and moderation, and they kind of see what has become of the tobacco control movement, and sometimes I think they're a little bit
interesting.
You know, taken aback by it.
Yeah, when you say created a monster, by the monster you mean a wave of stigma against smokers?
I would say so, and also just the monster maybe of tobacco control itself, that it's just it's grown as an industry. It is an industry that creates its own studies, its own research, a lot of which is quite faulty.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting.
It is interesting.
I don't know, because if you commit your life to something like that, it's I can see it being extremely difficult to turn around and say, well, actually I was wrong all of those years.
It's true. It's true.
And, you know, we're all in a similar position of sort of being stuck in our ways to an extent, so.
It's true, it's true. So I know that you also mentioned a little bit about the tobacco industry suppressing scientific evidence, as you call it. And though one thing I really like about your status report is that you point out, as we discussed earlier, that anti-tobacco groups have done the same thing to a certain extent from their own agenda.
Sure.
But I just want to talk a little bit about the tobacco industry supposedly suppressing scientific evidence. I'm just not sure that there's a lot of evidence that they've actually done that. I just wondered if you could name any specific examples.
So that's taken a bit out of context from my status report, because I was actually quoting somebody else who was listing ways that here's something that somebody else has said about what the tobacco industry has done. I think they list 4 ways in which the tobacco industry has altered or suppressed. So I think there were suppressed evidence, changed the standards for scientific research, controlled the way evidence is presented to the public. And my point in using these arguments is to say it's probably true to some extent that the tobacco industry is guilty of these things, but it's also true that the anti-tobacco industry is guilty of these things, and why is nobody talking about this?
True. Yeah, and I personally always feel that I don't think the tobacco industry is worse than any other industry. I think they're companies, they're corporations. Out to make a profit, just like any other corporation. So I think whatever suppression happens or spinning, I think is just what happens with any corporation.
Yeah, so I'm.
Or it did, at least in the past. I think now they really just can't say anything anymore.
So next on my reading list is this book, Doubt is Their Product. I forget the name of the author.
I've not heard of that.
But about what the author sees as the consistent manipulation of truth on the part of the tobacco industry. And the Doubt is Their Product is a reference to this, I'm sure maybe you're familiar with it, the memo, the infamous memo that was released to the public coming from a tobacco executive who to this day remains anonymous. And in this memo, this tobacco executive says, doubt is our product because doubt is the best way to create controversy and things of that nature. And if you read that in one section out of context, it's like, wow, this is a pretty evil thing that they're doing. But if you read the entire memo, it's a fascinating document. And they're saying things, like, well, they just said anti-cigarette at the time, but the anti-cigarette people are opportunists. They're very liberal in the sorts of arguments that they're willing to use against us, and they see themselves as and you guys, I'm sure, feel the same way as it's not that we're trying to manufacture uncertainty, but we're just trying to, here's another side to the story, which strikes me as entirely scientific, right? And the pursuit of science is supposed to be sort of a humble one. That was Karl Popper's big theory on philosophy of science, is that we can't actually prove anything with science, we can only falsify things. So anything that is presented as unfalsifiable is pseudoscience. And so for the, to try to not manufacture is sort of a loaded word, but to try to at least find doubt or reasonable other alternative is entirely within the realm of science and what science is for.
Well, I think, part of it, just has to do with the public notion of what science is now. People are just so bombarded with information and studies all the time. That there's a certain amount of fatigue of just not really understanding what science is. What you've just explained, I think most people have never thought about.
There's a great John Oliver segment on bad science where he talks about, you could find correlations between, there was one on like the amount of a certain type of cheese sold in a country, in a continent, and the number of homicides or something.
I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised.
So there are things like that, and I think people.
You could make a headline out of that saying cheese causes people to become homicidal maniacs.
Sure.
And then the cheese industry would defend themselves, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The cheese industry.
Big cheese.
Executives would be writing emails saying doubt is our product. It's interesting, but again, it seems that the science, when it comes from one side or the other, is not looked at the same way, and that's my big question.
Right. Well, I think one one part of it also is that people who come at something from the standpoint of idealism often have a slight advantage. When you're coming as a person presenting yourself as idealist and saying, well, we want to save people's lives, we want to protect children from harm, and you're coming up against a corporation that's making a product for money, then obviously it's quite easy to make yourself look like the good guy.
And everybody thinks they're the good guy. At the end of the day, I don't think anybody really has or very few people actually have bad intentions. And the problem is we just disagree as to what being the good guy looks like.
That's true. I think for me, to put it in a nutshell, I would say to be a bad guy in this situation is restricting people's freedoms. And I think that could be a very bad thing, but whether the public really views that, I don't know, it remains to be seen.
It is fascinating to me in a culture, especially like around Cambridge, that values so highly letting people decide for themselves what is a good life. We would never think to judge people's, other morally loaded habits.
Absolutely.
But when it comes to smoking and public health generally, people have much fewer qualms about telling people this is the way you should do it.
Absolutely.
Because
absolutely.
there's this tendency to see health as a
Yep.
unilaterally,
Yep.
the highest transcendental
Absolutely,
value.
as an absolute good. So
Right.
really, why would anyone want to argue against
Right.
health? Well, that kind of brings me to my next question. I mean, do you see, and what do you hope to accomplish with this with your grant, with this research, with your end product?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just here to learn things, really. But,
I think that's a great attitude, actually. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, the Software Center has connections if eventually this goes somewhere to some, publication or whatever, that's cool, but that's really not what I'm in it for.
But do you think that your research could have any potential ramifications to the world at large?
We'll see. I mean, I think as a 21-year-old undergraduate at this point, I'm not in a position, but I'm hoping that this research will, if nothing else, form me it's a lot for my own edification, but which maybe is not the spirit of practical ethics, but in order to shape me later on if I'm in a position to have some influence and stand up for counter-majoritarian institutions.
That's great. Do you find that you yourself are a bit contrarian, or you wouldn't say that?
Yeah, I say I definitely have a streak or two of contrarian.
I would say that about myself, so I can relate.
Yeah.
Or not, I would say.
Right. I mean, I don't really
Just
like
to be contrary, I'll say no.
Yeah, I don't like arguing with people, but I do have a bit of a soft spot for opinions that I feel have been poorly represented.
Absolutely.
Or,
Yeah, I think that's often the case, that you find there are things that just have, for whatever reason, just have not been aired at all, and views that haven't been aired, people who haven't been heard. And I think right now it's fair enough to say that smokers really aren't being heard in society, not being represented very well.
Sure.
Their views aren't being made known. So it's always really nice to hear about someone doing research like this.
Yeah, cool. I'm
absolutely.
happy to help. Again, I wouldn't classify myself as pro-smoking, anti-smoking, anti-smoking, or any of the above, but I am pro-freedom and I am pro-truth. And then those things strike me as very much consistent with what you guys are doing.
I think those are noble pursuits, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I heard that you were a fan of snus. Is that true?
So I played baseball in high school.
Okay. I can see where this is going.
That was the big thing to do in my high school was, that's sort of a part of the baseball culture is chewing tobacco, snus, not so much, but
there's a difference between chewing tobacco and snus, right?
Right, yeah, snus generally comes in like little pouches. But the sort of culture in baseball was like, oh, that's sort of like an easy way out.
Right. It's actually funny because I'm sure you're aware of the ban. I know you mentioned in your status report the ban in Fenway and indeed in all Boston stadiums, all tobacco products are banned. As to whether that's really being enforced, I don't know. But I actually had thought, has anyone told these poor professional baseball players that they should switch to snus because no one will know that they're doing it. Because you don't have to spit. It is
more core, I did bring up the smokeless ban. I have already too many directions I could go with this project, but this is another thing that struck me is the smokeless tobacco ban in Fenway. There doesn't seem to be any million harm to others justification.
Right, it seems indefensible to me.
The way that you hear the arguments made are, this is the right thing for our children, this is setting a good example.
Right.
So then there's a separate ethical question of, do we have an ethical obligation to not set a bad example for others by being an example of self-harm?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I know Audrey Silk, I'm not sure if you've heard of her, but she's probably one of the most active smokers' rights campaigners in the world. She's been active a very long time, a wonderful person. I remember reading one time something she wrote saying, that if she's smoking a cigarette on the street and someone tells her, well, no, you shouldn't be smoking in front of my child, I don't want them seeing that, she was saying, well, you're really violating my freedom of speech because I'm free to act in any way I choose. I don't have to set an example for your child.
That's interesting because I'm not convinced that smoking is a speech act in the same way that
it's debatable.
But there are interesting. I've got a reading list now of people who have tackled this ethics of example question.
Interesting. I'd be interested to find out more about that. So
maybe I'll keep sending you guys status reports.
You absolutely should. We would love to. We'd love to keep up with that. Yeah.
But I started using chewing tobacco when I was 15, and that was just kind of the in Albuquerque where I grew up. It was very easy to find. You find the gas station that don't enforce the law, and you go in and word gets out. And I mean, I've had a complicated relationship with it since, because I've tried to quit a bunch of times.
Yeah.
I know that at the same time I enjoy it, and that was a lot of the motivation behind. I had failed to mention that at the beginning because in an attempt to sort of remove myself.
Right.
From it
I mean,
and
well,
stay
probably
objective.
better not to make it too personal, but
Yeah, sure, but it is important.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm all for being upfront about my motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can see the argument of the professional athletes. You know, that they use that argument that they should set more of an example, but I still don't buy it. But
Sure.
anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Justin. This has been a really interesting discussion, and who knows, maybe we can have you back on again after you've completed your research. That would be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been great.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Cool.